1,000 better
1,000
stories.
better
1,000 better stories.
1,000 better stories.
You're listening to 1,000 Better Stories, the Scottish Communities Climate Action Network's podcast sharing stories of community-led climate action in Scotland to help us all imagine the better and fairer future and transform what we think is possible. Hello, it's Kaska, your story weaver. I'm looking out the window as I record this. It's sunny, hot, it's frankly weird weather for spring in Scotland. It's not just my imagination either. I've just seen the most recent update on climate trends from the Met Office, and the data confirms the long-term weather weirding trends. The world's temperatures are rising on average, but spring's become the fastest warming season here in the UK. And this spring has broken historical climate records. Not only was it the warmest and sunniest since the 1880s, but with the rainfall at 40% below the long-term average, it was also the driest spring in more than 50 years. Here in Fife, where I stay, our local mutual aid Facebook group kept pinging with warnings about imminent severe water shortages from SEPA, which were threatening our local farmers' ability to draw water from rivers for their thirsty fields. And on my daily walks, I saw our community garden volunteers frantically trying to keep up with watering their newly planted veg too. Don't get me wrong, I'm used to thinking about drought. I used to live in Australia, where it was a part of normal weather. But here in Scotland, it is a shock. There's absolutely no doubt that climate change is creeping into places where we live more and more these days. Droughts and heat waves are still perhaps more unusual, but the more intense flooding and storms have become real fixtures by now. The extremes and the impacts are no longer just news from lands far, far away. What can we do about it? How are we going to get our communities ready for those changes? To help me understand this, in November last year I attended the Narrating Change workshop, which was testing a new idea for how local community voices can be incorporated in developing relevant government policy and targets. I have to say I'm not the one normally studying policy in great detail, but the workshop was based around storytelling. So, as a story weaver, I simply could not resist. It was delivered by SCCAN in partnership with King's College London and funded by KLC's Impact Accelerator. A member of the story weaving team, my colleague Joanna Avilori, helped with the narrative components of the work, and it was led by Emma Yule, climate researcher and a member of SCCAN board. Today, you will hear from Emma and one of the workshop participants, Luke Fraser. They reflect on what they got out of the session and the wider ideas of adaptation and resilience in our communities, and how the Scottish Government policy fits into the picture as well. So I spoke to Emma online in mid-May, with hot, dry spring in full swing outside our respective windows. I started by asking where she was based.
I'm based strangely between Dunbar in Scotland and Paris in France. I spend some time between both places. And this project came about through a work that I was doing at King's College London on adaptation. So we put forward this idea of bringing together public sector and community groups, people within Scotland, to talk more about adaptation and our shared view of what a well-adapted place looks like.
And that comes out of your research on these topics, is that right?
Yes, that's true, yep. So I finished my PhD a few years ago from Edinburgh University that looked at adaptation in a number of forms, some looking more at the risk of extreme events and others more on the actions that mainly public sector and also what communities can do to prepare for things like extreme events and adapt to climate change. So yeah, this was a continuation of that work in climate adaptation.
So I thought we'd do some jargon busting first before
Sounds
we launch
good.
into the podcast. When I say climate adaptation, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
I think it's probably the word preparation. I think with adaptation, it's around how we can better prepare for things like flooding, heat waves, the impacts of climate change that we see right around the world and in Scotland as well. So thinking about recent floods that we've seen, recent storm events, and really thinking about how we can protect each other from those events, ourselves from those events, and also making sure that we're supporting those who are more vulnerable in our society to these particular events as well.
And can you give a practical example of what adaptation might look like in a community for an average person?
Yeah, so some of it would be more individuals, so maybe looking at flood protections on your house, looking at sandbags, for example. But I think the most effective actions are with groups, with communities that are coming together, maybe creating a resilient group to check during heat waves or floods, just an understanding of who is maybe more vulnerable within the community to be able to see that they're okay and have support during these events. Also things like nature-based solutions, so a lot of green space, tree planting has so many benefits for adaptation. Trees can provide shade and it can also take in water during heavy rainfall events as well.
Yeah, I quite like the idea of trees. I noticed like in the last few weeks we've had such a lot of sunshine here, not very typical for Scotland, and our streets here in Tayport are baking hot because it's all pavement, wall-to-wall pavement and lots of stone walls, and I've been sort of craving trees and shades, and I thought this would be a perfect solution to that kind of heat wave in our community anyway.
It really makes a huge difference. I think even from running as well, where I run, it's kind of this green corridor in Paris, and it's amazing. It's so cool in there that you can run fine, and then you exit the green corridor back into the concrete jungle, and it's so warm. So you really can tell the difference, I think, that green space can make in just cooling down the area. And I think in cities as well, it's particularly important.
Yeah.
And I think also just kind of having that conversation. So I think, weather is a topic that we talk about quite a lot anyway. So making that link between more extreme weather and climate change, and that we do need to be starting to think differently. Just having this conversation around what actions we can do and putting it on the agenda, and also how that ties in with the view that we see of a sustainable community and a sustainable town, and making sure that part of that is that we're creating a space that's safe and we're protected from these more frequent extreme events. Because mitigation, net zero is something that I think we talk about a lot more, and we're starting to talk about the need for adaptation. So I think, making sure that we are having these discussions.
So just to quickly explain what mitigation is to people.
Yes, the mitigation is looking at reducing emissions. So that's our net zero targets that we've maybe thought about. So things like energy efficiency, active travel, ways that we can reduce the emissions.
So reducing pollution that comes from fossil fuels.
Exactly.
And stopping the climate from changing too much in the wrong direction. Is that?
Yeah,
that's basically it.
Yeah.
And adaptation is to, because we haven't stopped all the change, we need to now adapt to some of the changes that are hitting us. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and the two are linked. The more mitigation we do, the less need there is for adaptation.
And so you've been thinking about adaptation for a very long time. Can you even remember when you first became concerned about this personally as like a central issue to focus on in your work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So with climate change, I think I've been thinking about this issue for a really long time, right through to when I was doing my undergraduate degree and seeing these changes and being really concerned about what we can do, and also just seeing the difference between the attitudes in different countries as well, and what the UK and Scotland were doing, seeing the impacts that I think were probably mainly in the global south then, and that kind of lack of response to that. So I think that kind of stuck with me. And then on the adaptation side, I remember I was doing a master's degree that was much more on mitigation. I don't think we talked about adaptation at all. It was mainly looking at renewable energy, electric vehicles, things like that. And I just remember thinking, well, if the climate is going to change and we're looking at these projections and the change in the trend, then how do we know that those solutions that we put in place will work? So how do we know that the trees that we're planting now to take in emissions, that those are the species that will be able to survive in droughts and heat waves and floods? How do we know that the energy, the electrical, the wind or solar, how do we know that the infrastructure will still be working and remain through these extreme events? So I think that had me thinking more around understanding more about the extremes that we face. And I think the extremes are really important. A lot of the time we talk about that average temperature change or even the global temperature change of, maybe heard 1.5 degrees of warming, 2 degrees of warming. But I think for me, trying to understand what that actually means for us, what that means in terms of the extreme events, the floods, the heat waves that we might see, and trying to make sure that we can protect ourselves from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've been sort of talking about what's coming based on scientific modelling and, the predictions and the stuff that's been happening mostly in the global south, in more vulnerable areas, climate affecting those communities a bit more. But have you experienced the effects of climate change in the community where you live? You're splitting yourself between two different places. And, what's worried you the most recently?
Yeah, I think the floods in Edinburgh were quite a shock to me. I hadn't seen floods like that before. That happened a few summers ago, and I think we're also at risk of that this year after such a dry period, that if there is heavy rainfall in the next weeks or months, that that can't be taken up by the ground in the same way. We can see how dry it is. So I think that is worrying. I was in Paris a few years ago for, I think it was the most extreme heat wave that Paris has seen. And it was awful. We had to leave work because they couldn't keep it cool enough. But then nobody at home could keep their homes cool enough either. Everybody was kind of going to shopping centres because that's where the air conditioning was, which was really strange to see. People kind of huddled in to the cafes and the spaces where the air conditioning was. And I think Paris is particularly vulnerable to this because it's one of the cities that was really built to keep us warm in the winter, and I think that's the same for a lot of UK cities as well. But it's really seeing temperatures that you would expect to see more in Spain or countries a bit further south that are more designed to stay cool in the summer than our cities in Scotland, in the UK, and in Paris as well. So I think there's also that kind of mind shift that we might really need to change the infrastructure, how we live, the spaces that are available within our communities as well for these kind of events.
Yeah, I remember going through Paris briefly a few years back. It must have been after that massive heat wave, because they had a sprinkler system, like a mister system installed in all the railway stations and big spaces just to help people cope with the temperature. So I was actually quite shocked at seeing that because I grew up in Europe and there was never hot enough summers to need that kind of infrastructure. But, we're needing that now, don't we?
Yeah.
From my experience, we've talked about how to stop the worst of climate change from happening, to stop the climate pollution for a long time. Now in Scotland and around the world, that's been the focus, climate mitigation. And I've been involved in community projects for over a decade now, but it's only very recently I've started hearing more about adaptation in that context. Certainly, SCCAN is only explicitly focused on it within the last couple of years. So we've got some specific work going on that. So from your perspective, why is all the attention on adaptation all of a sudden here in Scotland?
Yeah, I think there was a delay because initially I think adaptation was seen as almost, we weren't meeting the mitigation aims, and it was almost seen as giving up, I suppose, that we had to focus on adaptation and not the mitigation. But I think we've seen in the last few years in Scotland, the number of named storms, the number of flooding events, the heavy rainfall events, periods of dryness. So I think we're seeing it now. I think the populations, probably farmers, people that work on the land or close to the land, that have seen this for years and have been speaking about it for a long time in Scotland. But I think it's just touching more and more people now. And I think we're also making the link between that and climate change. So not seeing this as random weather or, natural disasters, but we're really making that link to this is what we are expecting to see with climate change. This is what, the models tell us. We're going to see more intense, more frequent events. So even though it can be tricky to say this event happened directly because of climate change, we know that it's all part of that same moving trend. So I think we're just kind of living with it more now and realising that we need to be changing some of the decisions that we're making around it. So even things like, making sure that hospitals don't overheat during heatwave events, things that are really important to our towns and communities. So I think it's coming higher up the agenda the more we experience it. It's actually part of the Paris Agreement that I think sometimes gets lost in the talk of net zero. But actually part of that agreement was also nations coming up with a national adaptation plan. So in Scotland, we're in the third iteration of that, so Scottish National Adaptation Plan 3. And that has kind of 5 key outcomes. And the main aim of the workshop to dig into the community's outcome a little bit more. So the aim is for communities to create climate resilient places.
Yeah, so that's just the SNAP 3, snappy title.
Yeah.
That's just come out. So this sort of workshop was coinciding with that policy document coming out from the government.
Yeah.
Very topical. So why do you think it's so important to get communities involved from the start in this work by the government?
Yeah, well, I think it's in there as the outcome of communities creating climate resilient places. So I think communities are really centred in that adaptation plan. And I think it's so important because these impacts will be felt in our communities. And I think the people that live in these areas can give the best experience of what that's like, maybe areas or people that are maybe more vulnerable to heat waves or floods, but also the kind of solutions to be part of that and know what solutions might work better than others for that particular community. And I think it's also really important that everybody is aware of this and can give their say as well.
Tell me more about the Narrating Change workshop and what were you hoping to achieve?
Yeah, so the main idea of the workshop was to look to see if we could create some adaptation targets and if targets work in this space. So this has been a bit of a challenge in the adaptation area around how we can set fair and effective targets. And the thought of targets really comes from the mitigation space, thinking that we have net zero targets. And it was often cited as a challenge on adaptation that we're maybe not progressing as much as we could because there's not that clear target as there is for mitigation. But to have a target really needs an understanding of what effective adaptation looks like. And that is also a really big question because it changes from place to place. It's really context specific. And it's really important to make sure that those that are most vulnerable to the events are centred. So it's not as easy to come up with one target as, say, emission reduction over a set time that we have for mitigation. So to create any kind of target really requires a kind of shared vision of what a well-adapted place looks like. And that was something that we really wanted to explore in the workshop to see if we could come up with that shared vision of a well-adapted place between community and public sector and have that discussion and then see, when we have this shared vision, is there any targets or particular points of change that need to happen to reach that target? So the main thing really was to understand what that climate resilient place looked like for both community and policymakers, and then what are the key changes that would be required to realise that vision.
And what were the key principles that shaped how the workshop was designed?
So one was around co-production, which is essentially just trying to bring different people with different backgrounds into a discussion and help kind of shape that narrative and come up with solutions. So co-production was something that has been talked about quite a lot, I think, in the adaptation space, but there's fewer examples of what that actually looks like in practice. So we were quite keen to use this idea and just see what that looked like, bringing people who maybe don't always speak to each other in that way together to see what kind of topics and solutions came from that. And the second one was around storytelling and narrative. So we worked with SCCAN's storytelling circle, particularly Joanna Avey-Laurie, who led that part of the workshop. And that was kind of around identifying stories and storytelling as the way that people make sense of the world around them. And we wanted to try and bring that into the workshop and make space for multiple stories and having that kind of discussion. And we also used it to almost place the workshop and the questions within the workshop in a story arc. So to think about what those visions are, but then what's the point of change? So that point of change in a story where everything just changes before we get to the ending. So what is that point of change that we would need to see to reach those visions of a resilient or well-adapted place? And I think that helped almost explore it as more of a journey rather than this is what we want to see, but thinking back a bit around how we get there, what are the key things that we'd need to change to end up in that well-adapted place.
How would this approach differ from the normal policy development process in Scotland?
So with the Scottish National Adaptation Plan and for the flood resilience strategy, there's been quite a focus on consultation and bringing in the views. And I think what we wanted to try was, rather than presenting any information, just having that discussion right from the start to see what came out. And I think co-production and participatory approaches have been discussed more and more in that setting, and how to make sure that we are bringing in the views of multiple people really early on in the process. And I think that's kind of the question around where do we want people's views? And I think we're seeing more and more that the earlier you bring that in to really shape that discussion, the more valuable that can be. So that was the approach that we tried to take, and we let the conversation flow rather than having really strict questions to answer. So yeah, and I think the storytelling approach also hopefully meant that people could kind of think outside the box a little bit and also bring in more of their personal experience and personal stories. And that was really something that came out of the workshop, that especially targets, but even just the approach to this needs to be a really human approach, and actually that kind of qualitative data and people's stories are really important in shaping that process and not just the quantitative side.
Well, thanks for explaining all this. Now, I think we're going to move to the... You have to admit, this co-production storytelling approach sounds intriguing. So what did it look like in practice? My recollection is a bit sketchy, as it's been over 6 months since the workshop took place, but I vaguely remember filling in a questionnaire, logging onto Zoom, being encouraged to think around adaptation in the shape of a story or a narrative arc, and then spending a couple of solid hours in facilitated small group discussions with others. We imagined better futures for our communities and considered plot twists and targets that could get us there. It was exciting to be in the room with people from all across Scotland and hear the stories of the communities. Once we got talking, it felt like we could have chatted for hours. I wondered what others in the room thought of the process, so I reached out to one of the participants, Luke Fraser. His background spans the local government and grassroots work in Orkney, and he offered a unique island community perspective on climate impacts. Typically of many people from small island communities, he's a man of many hats. I'll let him introduce himself.
I am based up in Orkney, on the Orkney mainland. I've got a number of roles. I work with the North Ronaldsay Trust, which is a development trust, a small island North Ronaldsay, is about 50 people. So I'm the community development manager there, running all the capital programs and various other bits and pieces that we do. I also run my own little consultancy, working with community groups across the Highlands and Islands, helping them with housing development projects, community capital projects, and just trying to help them develop projects as they go. And I'm a senior consultant at Aquaterra, which is an environmental consultancy. So I work for them a day a week on a range of kind of climate and renewables projects. And I'm also the chair of the Scottish Islands Federation. So work with lots of community groups across Scotland on a range of different things through that.
Lots of hats, lots of hats.
Lots of hats, ever growing.
Now, can you remember the moment when you really thought, we really need to think about adapting to what's happening with the climate here and now, where you work, where you live?
It's tricky. I've spent a lot of time. I spent 15 years in the Orkney Islands Council prior to moving into more community work and private sector work, and running house build programs, running a lot of the energy efficiency projects and programs. So we've done a lot around net zero for quite a while. It's been the buzzword, but adaptation's been kind of in the background. But with our island communities, Orkney in particular, we've been doing loads and loads on renewables and stuff. We're groundbreaking in a lot of those areas, tidal and a lot of wind turbines. So we've generated 120% of our energy demand. So on the net zero front, besides things like ferries and planes and things like transport, and we're doing quite well. But it's the potential impact of climate change, things like sea level rises and various other things, extreme weather, and the impact that they're going to have on island communities, more so than some other areas. But what happens if wasn't really getting the same attention? Like one of our islands, if sea levels got by a metre, it could get split into three. No way the government's going to be funding bridges and all those sort of things. If that happens, Inverness is underwater, so is Glasgow. So it's a real issue in terms of that resilience and long-term sustainability. So yeah, you just look at our infrastructure. A lot of our roads are at sea level, housing development, a lot of our key infrastructure has been built on not floodplains, but areas that aren't that high above sea level. There's an awful lot of big planning decisions based on short-term thinking, and adaptation is one of those. If we're going to do proper community planning, if we're going to do proper development planning, we have to start taking those things into consideration. We're taking net zero into consideration. You've got to put heat pump in, you've got to put as much solar panels as you can, but the fact you're still building in a floodplain doesn't really come into the equation, which seems a bit daft. So it's trying to pivot it, particularly from our islands that are already finding sustainability and resilience an issue.
Yeah. Are you seeing any sort of effects of climate change now? I mean, you obviously used a little bit to extreme weather. You were just saying that about a storm coming on the weekend that will possibly stop people accessing different islands by ferry and all that. Is there evidence of things happening?
We're certainly seeing more coastal erosion. North Ronaldsay has an A-listed monument, Sheep Dyke, that goes all the way around the island, and we're certainly seeing coastal erosion impact on that. It's knocking bits down because the sea's getting closer to it. The storms are impacting on it. So we're certainly seeing elements of that. The weather we've had recently, I'm not sure if that's climate change, but we'll have more of that. It's climate change.
It's been sunny, hasn't it? It's been sunny and dry.
Yeah, we're seeing things like water shortages. The idea that someone like Orkney will potentially in July, because Scottish Water were tankering water in previously. Now, a lot of that might not be climate change. It may just be that the whole population's expanding, we're all using more water. But again, all that needs to be tied into it as well. We need to figure out how we're going to do all this within the wider picture of everything else that's going on. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what that did with gas prices and how that links to electricity. It all interacts. And it's trying to make our places as resilient as we can be against those outside elements, and climate adaptation is a huge part of that.
Yeah. We've been using two terms, adaptation and resilience. Can you maybe expand on what they mean to you?
I think there's certainly adaptation. Obviously, it's adapting to what the new reality might be, and resilience is the way that in a sense, you're doing that. We know there may be potential for sea level rises, so it's how do we adapt our infrastructure? How do we adapt how we live in terms of ferries and various things to extreme weather? North Ronaldsay gets a ferry a week in winter and 2 ferries a week in summer, if it's lucky. But if the wind come on those scheduled days, you get gales again, they can go 3-4 weeks without a boat. And so the island already has adapted to that. People have deep freezes and various things. But again, you're also getting an increase in power cuts. So a deep freeze is fine until you have a 3-day power cut, and then you're chucking out everything away. So it's that sort of thing. How do we adapt to, how do we actually say to people, well, let's put some battery storage and some solar and allow you to disconnect from the network so that actually, if you've got a 2-day power cut, you've got some generation, some battery storage, you've got a wood burning stove, you've got the ability to keep yourself resilient, but you're doing it because of the fact you've needed to adapt, because the systems are either not working the way they should, climate's impacting on things. You've got to adapt to that, but you're doing so in a way that enhances your resilience, which in turn will enhance your sustainability. And you're going to lose people from the islands if they're getting power cuts every month and they're 3 or 4 days without electricity and they try to work from home and that doesn't work. Sorry, I can't dial in today. I've got no power again. You can't continue doing that way of life for long without needing, I need to make a change. So it's trying to adapt your infrastructure in a way that makes it more resilient.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing all the stories around what's happening where you are. And not everybody's aware of the island context, so thanks for sharing the examples there. So let's turn to the workshops. What were your expectations and what made you decide to take part? I
think the first thing is when I heard about the workshop, it was my ears pricked up because nobody'd been discussing this stuff. You know, me and a number of others, we'd be kind of thinking we need to be looking at this, but everything that was coming out with my various different hats on was net zero. I'm going, well, that's fine, but what about the other side? So when the workshop invitation came out, the first thing was just brilliant. Somebody's looking at this. It's not just me and crazy like I am. It was really good to be able to get that. So I think the expectation was just to have a conversation with some people who were maybe thinking similar things. You know, it was getting into it. The fact that it was a workshop was great because it wasn't going to be, you weren't going to be talked at for an hour or two by somebody giving a presentation, but no chance to feed in. It was the fact that, no, this is a bunch of people getting together to have a discussion and to see where we're at and find out where everybody else is. Because as you mentioned, the islands are different. Yeah, and a lot of the thinking is often central belt thinking. So it's how is this going to impact those areas? Well, actually, it's a different kettle of fish up here. It's just different. Neither's better than the other, but it's going to impact everywhere. But it's just making sure we could bring that island approach to it as well. Because some of the stuff that is going on up here probably will be really useful from other areas, and vice versa. Some of the things happening elsewhere will be brilliant and will maybe be really good projects that we could jump in onto.
What was it like to be in the room with, policymakers, government people and other community members like you? How did it feel?
It felt like a regular day, to be perfectly honest. I spent 15 years at the council running house building stuff. So you're in the room with senior officials, you're in the room with MSPs some of the time, and you're also, with the other hat on, you're in the room with communities too. So it was great that there was a really wide range of people there. So that was really good, that it wasn't just the community people in a corner banging a drum. There was that range of people, there was that range of experience and expertise there. It was also really, really good that we were invited in with the community hat on, because often this stuff will, a number of agencies have met over here and they've decided what's happening, and we're all going, well, that's not going to work. So it was really, really handy to be able, to have that engagement quite early on, before a whole bunch of decisions to be made on things as to kind of what the way forward was. So that was really, really good.
Now, during the workshop, we were asked to put some of our ideas into a story. Did you find it easy or hard to put your experiences into stories?
I think you'll know from my other answers. Quite easy. Chatting is something I'm quite good at. Stories is a good way of trying to help, especially on the community side of things, try and get people engaged and involved, show that to get their stories on how it impacts, but also to give stories that they can relate to. And that certainly works quite well. And particularly when you're working across islands, it's really good to build a network, because often it's one individual on each of these islands that is responsible for that element. And they often can feel as though it's just them. So when you're bringing in other communities and people are, we've got that same thing. This is how we've done it. This is what we've worked on. That networking works really, really well. So it's a really good model to use to try and bring that community experience in.
Do you remember because we were supposed to jump first to our vision of resilient community, what our communities would look like if they were resilient? Do you remember the details of what you shared, or if not, maybe what other people shared?
I don't think I remember the actual story, but I think when we were looking at that resilience, it is very much about community sustainability and resilience going hand in hand. You can't have community sustainability without that resilience piece, and that short-term resilience, that's disaster management, that's power cuts gone out, how do we deal with that very short-term thing? But it's also that longer-term resilience of how do we grow more of our own food? How can we be more sustainable and more resilient locally? It's that ability to do more for ourselves at a local community level.
Mm-hmm. Do you think hearing other people's stories and conversations in the workshop and, thinking about it a bit more, has this really affected how you think about adaptation in your own community, in your own work?
Yeah, it certainly helped because of the fact some people were coming at it from the nature-based side of adaptation as well. So it was good to get a range of experiences in other areas that just I've not really worked on or worked in.
So have you used any of that thinking in the last few months in terms of what you're doing, like practical things?
What it's done is it's just reinforced that requirement and that feeling that the adaptation is a key thing on the climate side we need to get right. And a number of development trusts up here in Orkney have been working as part of an extension of the Carbon Neutral Islands project that the Scottish Government's developed. And so we've got a kind of cluster up here of islands who are working through community climate action plans. And we've been able to draw adaptation into that to an extent of saying, like, it's the resilience piece. It's having the confidence to go, this needs done. This can't just be about how do we get carbon emissions down. And CNI's done some really, really good stuff there on how to kind of do the adaptation side of things, which is building on that and trying to do cross-island projects to try and bring that resilience piece in, not just on an individual island level, but at a wider scale across the islands in Orkney and beyond as well. So I think that it's just had the confidence to kind of go in, no, this is something that the government is now looking at too. We can potentially get ourselves positioned to access any funding that might come up, or to kind of show some of the really good potential projects that are out there.
It's really nice to see that this kind of net zero climate mitigation work that you're doing is getting connected to adaptation now. It's fantastic. Now, if you could invite your local council or government to do one thing differently, what would it be in terms of looking at co-creating targets or co-creating ideas for resilience?
I think the key thing would be bring communities in at a very early stage. And by community, I don't mean local authority. The government often says we're putting stuff down to community, and they mean councils, and that's fine. Councils do a really good job. The climate team at Orkney Islands Council is brilliant. But when they talk about community, they should mean community. And the National Islands Plan's got some really good stuff, some really good kind of consultation on that at a very community level going on at the moment. But it's being facilitated by Scottish Islands Federation. So with my SIF hat on, we're working with them on that. But it is difficult writing policy that has Glasgow at one end and an island of 5 people at the other. You need that flexibility. It's making sure you're bringing in people who are engaged across each of those communities, or as many of those communities as possible, to feed into those things. And I think National Islands Plan's doing that at the minute. I think there's real opportunity. I think just continuing that conversation will be really useful, and having, as I mentioned, communities at the grassroots levels in that conversation will be really, really helpful, just to try and develop it, because we're all looking at, and again, I've just come from a meeting on it, we've got community climate action plans, which are now being asked to develop, which is great. As part of CNI, some really good work there. We all have community development plans, mostly in our Islandwood Development Trust, which is the economic side of things and the cultural side of stuff as well. And we're now also looking at place plans. So there's an awful lot of interaction amongst all 3 of those plans. They all kind of cross over to an extent. And I think we've got real opportunity there with the adaptation piece to tie a lot of that in. Your place plans are very, very place-based. So that gives you how's your infrastructure climate resilient, which also ties into community climate action plans. And then you've got your economic development side of that, which is, again, ties in with your resilience of, well, how do you keep your economy going? How do we keep ourselves in a position where we're able to sustain our communities and keep them moving as well? So I think there's a really good opportunity here to tie adaptation into all of those different things that are being discussed and looked at the moment. And it's great that the community climate adaptation plans are bringing some of that resilience in from that climate angle, but it's now trying to tie that into the community sustainability. And that's certainly what I'm trying to do with the Development Trust up here. We're looking at that element, that ability to say, well, yep, that works here, but also if we tweak a little bit, it'll do this, 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 and this as well. So it's trying to make sure we're doing that with a holistic approach. And I think that's a kind of key thing is making sure that the communities at a very, very grassroots level are involved, and all the different groups are involved in that. So I think there's real opportunity there.
I found it really interesting to share the Zoom room with people from such disparate contexts, those working in local communities and those involved in policy development. I talk to people involved in grassroots climate action all the time, but I'd never had an in-depth conversation with anyone developing or implementing the policies within local and central governments before. I was particularly struck by the difference in the way we talked about adaptation. Like Luke, I remember wanting to share specific stories about Tayport, where I live. People closer to the government end were more comfortable referring to generalised points in the policy documents instead. Both valid approaches to talking about the subject, but the contrast showed the importance of working towards a shared language in such co-production settings at the interface of policy and community. For many, sharing lived experience is a natural way to communicate. For others like myself, with my science background, use of anecdotes is one of the first things that is beaten out of us during induction into the rules of proper science communication. It's been a hard thing to unlearn. Yet stories are such a powerful way to exchange knowledge and engage people. It all made me think about ways I could warm up everyone's storytelling muscles in similar settings so that we can all the better connect to each other through stories. I wondered what Emma took away from the workshop. What was your role during the workshop, apart from, designing it all and organising it all?
Yeah, well, during the workshop, I was a facilitator in one of the groups, which was great to hear the conversations that came out of that. I really, really enjoyed it. And I actually would have wanted more time, but maybe the participants wouldn't agree to discuss in even more depth. It was really valuable session for me. It was a good feeling. I was really happy with the people that came along, and also how willing everybody was to engage in it.
Yeah. Was there a moment during the workshop where you thought, yes, this is why we're doing this?
The discussion around the narrative and even the words that are used, I think was so valuable to me. So we talked a bit about the word resilience and adaptation and the difference between them. And the word resilience, I think, is an interesting one. I think resilience is usually talked about as almost like the end goal of adaptation. So you take lots of adaptation actions and you're wanting to build resilience for a place that can deal and cope with a variety of different situations. And with resilience, for me, that usually embodies things like reduction in poverty, things like that, the kind of socio-economic angle that makes people more resilient to a wide variety of impacts. And someone mentioned in the workshop that for resilience that felt like a really negative term, because to be resilient you've had to go through something and suffer something. And for them, the connotations of resilience were just kind of getting by and surviving. So I thought that was really interesting, that my thought of resilience, of this like sustainable, fair society, to somebody else meant just getting by and barely surviving. So when you're having those discussions with people, what was in their mind was completely different to what I was coming in the space with. So I think that was such a valuable lesson, just how different people view this, and actually the need for positivity and viewing adaptation and building resilience as something that can make our communities a better, safer, fairer space really came across.
Yeah, that's interesting, because adaptation and resilience, maybe less resilience, but adaptation is always sort of a negative thing, because it's coping with something that will try to negatively impact your life, destroy your life, flooding and all that. But having this shift of maybe building a better place, because that's what we want to do. We don't just want to fight fires, we want to fight fires with good friends. I don't know. I don't know if that's a good analogy.
No, but that's what motivates me, I think, to work in this space, is that, at the end, hopefully we're trying to build something that is fair for people, where there's less inequality, people can access what they need, and the communities are a safe space to be. So I think it touches on all those different angles. And
She's being stronger.
Yes.
Better connected.
Yeah. And I think that really came out of the workshop as well. That self-sufficiency of communities came up as one of the outcomes or the topics that were discussed across the different breakout rooms. And I think that's really interesting as well, because sometimes in organisations or even in policy as well, there's that siloed approach, even between climate adaptation and climate mitigation, let alone health, education. Yeah, there's all the different silos. And I think the fact that really came across strongly as self-sufficiency in communities means that we're going to need to make the links between all these different areas and make sure that solutions are resilient to extreme events, work on mitigation, are good for health and well-being, are reducing inequality. And we do see that there's things like principles for good adaptation that are coming out of research and policy. And that is the language that's being spoken about, reducing vulnerability, looking at these holistic solutions. And I think the workshop really made that clear as well.
And it was emerging from people's stories as well. So it's nice to have stories first. And stories last, to me. It's like, you need to see what's out there, and stories are a good way of getting to grips with it. And then you can distill it into sort of more scientific or policy thinking and principles. But then it's nice to be able to communicate things as examples, real examples that people can relate to as well.
Yeah.
Is there any other sort of themes that emerged from the analysis? Because you've been analysing all the conversations and analysing all the surveys you did. And thinking about it for a few months now.
Yeah, I think something else that came out was on the engagement side, and that we talked about consultations and how we get different views. And I think how you invite people into a space was really important. So there was a lot of discussion on engagement, that there is such a thing as bad engagement, as negative engagement, that can leave people feeling more alienated after that experience if it's felt that the views haven't been taken on board, for example, or there's not a kind of next step or that kind of way to discuss after the workshop, I think, or after a consultation. So yeah, I think that really came through, and also around thinking about the space that the meetings are held in. Is it a space that people can easily access? What time is it? Is it a time that works for people? Is it a good length of time? Is it too long? Is there funds available to cover childcare, transport costs, for example? So I think, how we invite people into the space and how we explain it and the value that we see from people's participation, I think needs to be really strong and come out. So it's given me some thought as well, especially on the invitations, and are we making this space as accessible as we possibly can? And that was really important for this workshop. But I think, something that's really in my mind for future workshops as well. I think we can always do better.
Are you doing anything differently in your own work as a result?
The target side, I find it a really interesting area around adaptation targets, and I think we see from the workshop that in the discussions there were lots of views that were positive and thought targets could be really helpful, but equal number of views that thought that they could be negative. And I think if we want to build resilience, and sometimes it's called transformational adaptation, which is taking into account that we need to be reducing inequality and we need to be changing the power dynamics so that there's more control and decision making within communities, which addresses the self-sufficiency and community point as well. So this whole idea of targets and how can a target measure that shift, that mindset shift, that shift to the power dynamics, who is making these decisions, who has the power to make these decisions, which targets or a quantitative target would be very, very difficult to measure what we want to see. So are we measuring things that are valuable, the number of homes that are flooded, for example, hospitals overheating? That is really, really important. But that bigger shift, that shift to resilience, the transformational adaptation, how can we see that that's progressing? How do we know that we're moving in the right direction? So I think that came up really strongly for me, more on the research side, I suppose, around how we measure that. And actually I think stories really have a role to play, because with stories we can kind of test where we are with how people are feeling around that shift. Are we shifting to a society that's more equal, where more people are making decisions or not?
So what are your hopes for what's next with Narrating Change or similar work?
Yeah, I hope that we can do more workshops that are similar. This one was almost a pilot, just to see how people felt about the experience. So I think it would be great to have more of these workshops that are co-produced, and maybe making them even more official. So if we could do that in a community space where we co-produce solutions, different people's thoughts, what we want that community to look like in the future, and then we're able to implement those solutions, I think that would be really great. I think it would be great to have more examples of that, and maybe more examples of it in practice, because ours was kind of more on the theoretical side, just to see what came out of it and what people thought about the experience. So I think there's a lot of good work that could be done in this space. Yeah, our doors at SCCAN are always open, so more than happy to have discussions with anyone who's keen to talk about this.
It was great to have a chance to reflect back on this experience and see the palpable value people took away from the session. I truly hope more of this kind of co-production, storytelling-based design will be applied to community consultations, where the output actually feeds directly into adaptation policy and its implementation around Scotland. Emma would love to hear from you, by the way, if you'd like to have a chat about this work and how you could get involved in the future. Email us on stories@scan.scot and we will put you in touch. Just a reminder that the funding for the project and the podcast came from AHRC Impact Acceleration account hosted by the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at King's College London, and the project was supported by the faculty's Impact and Knowledge Exchange team as well as SCAN. I linked relevant resources in the show notes for you, including a couple of key adaptation readings suggested by Emma for communities who may want to have discussions about what adaptation means to them. I also shared 2 podcast episodes from our friends at Local Zero, who are focusing on community adaptation at the moment. There is a primer on adaptation and resilience with Emma herself, as well as one covering the growing problem of water scarcity in Scotland, which I found particularly interesting in the light of this spring's water shortage situation in Fife. Before I sign off, I'd like to let you know that we've had some good news about funding for the next 3 years, and we will have a related podcast series coming up soon, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, we're happy to share your audio stories on community climate action in our podcast crossover series to help you grow your own audience. Just drop us an email. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and share it with others. It'll really help us reach a wider audience. If something exciting is happening in your own community, be sure to let us know so that we can help you tell your own story. You can drop our story weavers a line at stories@scan.scot. It's scan, SCCAN, .scot, SCOT. We also offer training and mini grant support to community storytellers. To keep up to date with our offerings and everything SCAN, check out our website at scan.scot or find us on Twitter, Facebook or Instagram, or simply sign up to the newsletter.